Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Kia orana, nisa bola, talofa loba. Welcome everybody. Really lovely to have you here today for another CID talk on the Human Rights Strategic Action Plan. So my name is Philippa Smales. I'm the Business and Development Member Engagement Manager here at the Council for International Development. I'm really honoured today to have another speaker, another expert from MFAT. So recently we've had a couple. We had one on the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategic Action Plan. We had one on the Gender Action Plan. And now we've got Claire with us, who's going to talk about the Human Rights Strategic Action Plan. She's going to give us a bit of an overview of that. And then very kindly, she's going to be around for lots of questions, which I'm sure all of you will have. So as you listen to her, make sure you keep a note of your questions so you don't forget them later, or do feel free to just pop them in the chat whenever you're ready. But Claire, take it away.
Thanks so much, Philippa. Kia ora koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Claire toku whenua, no rotura aho, no te whenua mowi a hoki aho, ke piripani aho. So my name is Claire Mann. I am from Rotorua and I'm also from Australia, and I'm currently coming to you from Brisbane. So please forgive if my accent sometimes switches a bit more Australian than Kiwi. I promise I am a New Zealander. I am the Senior Advisor on Human Rights at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I'm here to present to you our Human Rights Strategic Action Plan for International Development Cooperation. And I'll just get my PowerPoint, sharing that with you so that you can follow along with what I'm talking about. Let's get that up. Okay. So I'm going to do a PowerPoint that shows you what's in the action plan, talks through a range of different aspects, and then we'll have time for questions. So I'm going to just first of all tell you where you can find the action plan and a bit about why we've developed this, what the context of it is, the approach that the New Zealand government is using in its human rights in development work, and the different priorities that we have and what we're hoping to achieve with this. So you can find the New Zealand Human Rights Strategic Action Plan on the MFAT website now. For those who may have been looking for it previously, it's only just been put up in the last few days, so you haven't been missing it. It's just not been there yet. But if you go to the aid and development part of the New Zealand MFAT website and our approach to aid, you can scroll down, you find the Human Rights Action Plan, and you can then find the Gender Action Plan, as well as the Child and Youth Action Plan, and our Climate Change Action Plan. Now, I just want to distinguish a little bit, first of all, that if you've been Googling, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the SEO bots to do their work to make sure that things are easily Googleable. But most probably you've already come across the New Zealand International Human Rights Action Plan. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the difference between these two and why it's very misleading names and language in terms of, sorry, not misleading, confusing, similar names, but these are in fact two different documents that serve two different purposes. And I will explain a bit about that. But let's start off with, this is what it looks like. So when you download the document from the website, this is the first page of the Strategic Action Plan. Just a little note, it's designed to be printed on A3 documents. My apologies if you're printing on A4 and need a magnifying glass to read it, but that's how we roll. Apparently the New Zealand government wants everything on A3 documents, which means we need to cram our information into that. So hopefully you can see what it's about, but I'm going to unpack some of these things in here. And first of all, I'll just start by explaining why this comes about. So in terms of our International Development Cooperation Program, we have a clear priority for making sure that human rights is central to the work that we're doing. This has been a priority under New Zealand's, under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Strategic Intentions document, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it's also a key part of our International Cooperation for Sustainable and Effective Development Policy, or New Zealand's ICE policy. So this strategic action plan on human rights, there was a priority deliverable mandated that MFAT must deliver to Parliament 3 different strategic action plans, one on human rights, one on gender, and one on child and youth wellbeing. So you've heard from the other my 2 colleagues, Tara D'Souza, who's in charge of gender, and Maria Carling, who's in charge of child and youth wellbeing. They've presented to you the other 2 strategic action plans. So this is the 3rd of those priority deliverables when it comes to our approach to aid and development and the incorporation of human rights principles into that work. Our Human Rights Action Plan is, of course, consistent with and supports the 2030 SDGs and the idea that we've all committed to in our development work of leaving nobody behind. And it aligns with our advocacy priorities that are in New Zealand's New Zealand's International Human Rights Action Plan 2019 to 2023. Now, this action plan, the New Zealand's International Human Rights Action Plan, sets out the priorities that the New Zealand government has in all of its foreign affairs work, all of its multilateral work, our advocacy priorities for what are the key human rights issues that the New Zealand government will be working on, will be supporting, will be taking a leadership role on in terms of international advocacy. I think of it as our advocacy priorities, because that's essentially what that document is. That is coming up to, so that set out those priorities for that 4-year period, coming up to the conclusion of that in a couple of years' time. And my colleagues in our multilateral division have already begun consultations on the drafting of the next iteration of that human rights action plan for our international advocacy. Think of that more as our foreign policy perspective on things, and what this Human Rights Action Plan that I'm presenting to you, it's our development programming perspective. So that's the difference between the 2. One's the foreign policy advocacy priorities. This one that I'm going to be talking about is our prioritization and our approach to our international development cooperation, so to our aid programming. So, of course, the aid programming draws a link and puts in place our overall government's foreign policy advocacy priorities as well, that they have to draw from each other. The big thing about our Human Rights Strategic Action Plan is that it really centralises a human rights-based approach explicitly throughout our work. And I'll be talking more about that in a moment. So, I just want to kind of start by putting us back in the context of how does the New Zealand government do inclusive development? What is our inclusive development approach? And the key of this is our ICED policy, our International Cooperation for Effective and Sustainable Development policy. And under this policy, this has committed us to using a human rights-based approach to address inequality across all dimensions of social identity, and looking at gender equality and women's empowerment, and child and youth wellbeing. But really one of the essential aspects of this is this idea that we begin our development work by trying to understand and respond to the causes and incidents of poverty and exclusion. And this idea that we're focusing on duty bearers and rights holders. So this language comes from the commitment that the Cabinet has made when it comes to human rights and inclusive development, that we want to be thinking about who are the duty bearers when it comes to human rights and who are the rights holders, and how can we support both of these different groups to make sure that the benefits of development are equitably shared. And of course, one of the foundational principles of a human rights-based approach is this idea of participation and ensuring full and meaningful participation in the development process. So that's the big picture of our inclusive development approach. Our goal for the Human Rights Strategic Action Plan is that our development cooperation will advance the realisation of human rights and prioritising people and groups at risk of being left behind. So we have a very clear kind of mainstreaming focus here in terms of realisation of human rights, but also this idea that it's about how do we contribute to realising the enjoyment of human rights. So not just preventing human rights abuses, but what is the power of a human rights-based approach in ensuring that we actually increase overall enjoyment of human rights, with, of course, that prioritisation, which will require targeted approaches for people and groups most at risk of being left behind in the development processes. The context of this, I don't really need to spell out too much for all of you, because you're the ones living and breathing it in the work that you're doing on the ground. So we all know that the causes and consequences of inequitable enjoyment of human rights is poverty, inequality, marginalisation. These things both stem from and lead to discrimination, poor health, limited economic empowerment, poverty, violence. The list could go on. These are the issues that are your bread and butter. And of course, we all know how these are exacerbated or disproportionately exacerbated by crises, including COVID, but also climate change, and particularly of importance for our region of the world, natural disasters. So when it comes to these kind of issues globally, we know that progress towards the SDGs is still a big challenge for us. We know that there are various different challenges to the rules-based international system that we're all very much trying to protect and continue to promote. And we have various different non-state actors, emerging technologies. All of these things are challenging, as they have for a long time, challenging the idea of the centrality of government and the democratic principles that governments uphold. And we also have many threats to human rights defenders, which again is something that is at your door for many of you who are working on the ground. So in this context, if we then drill down to what's happening in our region in the Pacific, before I do that, I will just say it's important to come back to this idea that when we're talking about the SDGs and the fact that human rights is fundamental to how we achieve the SDGs, and that this is still a challenge. The reason why these are so important to each other is that 92% of the SDGs are linked to human rights. So we can't really talk about one without the other. If we're aiming to impact the SDGs, then one of the ways in which we do that is through promoting the realization of human rights. So let's drill down to the Pacific. We know here that one of the great achievements in the Pacific over the last few years has been this growing engagement by Pacific Island countries in the international human rights system. So we have Fiji chairing the Human Rights Council. We've had the Committee on the Rights of the Child session in Samoa. We have a greater ratification of human rights treaties throughout the region. We have engagement in the Universal Periodic Review and other human rights mechanisms. This growth in appetite and desire to engage with the human rights system and to tell the story of development in the Pacific through using the human rights narrative is a really important thing of note. And of course, going along with that and kind of both feeding into it and pushing this is the vibrant civil society movement. What this means in terms of pressure domestically with our Pacific neighbours is that we have this focus on strengthening national human rights institutions, as well as reporting and monitoring mechanisms. We still have those usual difficulties that New Zealand faces and the Pacific Island countries face as well, with our geographical isolation and other constraints, resource constraints, particularly for our Pacific neighbours. And these both impact upon the implementation of human rights, but also the monitoring and reporting of these. And of course, we still have that perception that cultural and social norms are a further barrier to human rights, and that there's somehow a conflict between these two things. Happy to talk about this more in questions, but my basic approach to this is that I think SPC is doing some fantastic work in trying to use cultural and social norms to promote human rights, and that we need to stop seeing these as being at odds with each other, but rather ways that we can enhance the story of human rights through using cultural and social norms. I want to give it the context of how much is the New Zealand government currently spending on human rights issues. So throughout our aid program, so remembering our aid program is about $2.4 billion over a 3-year period, we spend 8.7 of that, so nearly 9% of that, on what's called principal human rights activities. And this figure includes disability as part of human rights, even though the OECD counts these separately. And what this means is that these nearly 9% of our spending goes towards activities that are completely designed to impact the enjoyment of human rights and that have human rights as central to the design and programming focus. 42% or nearly 43% of this funding goes to activities that are labelled significant human rights. What this means is that the core purpose of the project is not just human rights, but it's other things, but it also takes a human rights approach to the work that it does. Or human rights is one of the aims of the project, but not the only aim of the project. So this means that over half of our aid money goes towards projects that are either principally or significantly labelled human rights activities. So this is a significant investment, and this is a fantastic kind of indication as to how important human rights is in terms of our aid and development spend. I would love to see this figure rise, and I think, from a theoretical point of view, all of our aid programming should be targeted towards the achievement of human rights. But what this means in terms of counting is that it starts to lose significance. So when we count, we're trying to be very, very clear and careful about, is this activity designed to specifically address human rights issues, or is it designed to contribute to human rights outcomes, or does it not have a human rights focus at all? And it's probably that other half that we're trying to target to say, well, how do we change this? How do we make sure that these activities do have a human rights approach to the way in which they're designed, human rights impacts in terms of the outcomes that the programming is addressing? And I'd be, one of my theories with this is that there's actually a lot of our work out there that is not being counted here but should be, and part of our approach is to make sure that we are recording those things better by recognizing better what human rights actually means when it comes to development programming. So we're trying to make sure that we're focused on the realization of all human rights for all people. We do this through looking at improving economic, social and cultural rights, so health, education, water, housing, sanitation, etc., work, labour standards, food security. And we also look at civil and political rights, so good governance, rule of law, political participation, those justice programs, etc. So we're not distinguishing between one or the other, we're doing all of these things. And this is our theory of change in terms of how we do that. We're beginning with looking at how do we build human rights capabilities. We want to understand that, we want to deepen the understanding that our team has, that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs team has, as well as that our partners have, our bilateral government partners, our civil society partners, our implementing partners. And we want to create an environment and a culture where human rights are integrated into our development practice. We want to use that growing capability to improve the implementation of human rights. So to ensure then that our development programming actually contributes to reducing those structural and societal inequalities, and that it's focused on enhancing well-being for all. And if we do those well, then what we will be doing is advancing the realization of human rights. So contributing to empowering rights holders and strengthening those systems that ensure that nobody is left behind. And we want to make sure we're doing that while also doing no harm. So that's kind of the overarching approach that we're using for our human rights strategy. And a big part of this, if we turn to that first one about that building capabilities, is trying to shift a little bit of our understandings around what human rights mean. So this is meant to be kind of a balancing seesaw here. Please excuse the fact that the graphic image isn't that awesome. Graphic skills are not my forte, unfortunately, but luckily for you all human rights, I'm a little bit better at that. But the idea is that we're trying to shift the understanding that human rights is not just political advocacy things or sensitive and risky things or of how much we invest, etc. But it's actually also these other things. It's about both individual rights and collective rights. It's about entitlements as well as freedoms. And it's not just that advocacy, but it's also what we do in our development cooperation. It's both values and legal standards. And so this is trying to make sure that when we're thinking about our development cooperation work, we're shifting that mindset from that idea of compliance and avoiding human rights violations, and making sure that we're really understanding what is the fundamental role that human rights plays in building the ground for good development. So we want human rights to be values that guide our work and they inform our policies and programs, but there are also legal standards which we can be held accountable to, and they inform the targets that we're trying to achieve as a development program. So what this means is that we're putting this in the context of saying, overall, what we're trying to do is to be more proactive about how does human rights contribute to good development outcomes. And one of the ways that we're going to be doing this is through applying a human rights-based approach more explicitly in the work that we're doing. And this fits in very much with the common agenda that was released at the General Assembly this year by the Secretary General, where he's trying to centre human rights again as a part of our social contract, and talking about how human rights are a problem-solving tool. And so for us as the New Zealand government here, the human rights-based approach to our development programming is our way of wielding this problem-solving tool for our aid programming. So we have a few operating principles, and these are probably relatively familiar from the other action plans that you've seen. Of course, we begin first and centre with integrating a titiriti approach. We, as I've said, a big part of this is that we're applying a human rights-based approach, and we have those that we've analysed and broken down the relationship between titiriti and a human rights-based approach and the interlinkages there as well. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we respect and protect rights holders, but that we also uphold and defend. So it's not just about doing no harm, but it's also about proactively doing good and trying to make sure that we are promoting and advancing the implementation of human rights. Of course, we need to make sure that we have our business processes, our back of house sorted to minimise and mitigate adverse consequences from development, and be very aware of that in our programming design. And as is the case for all of the New Zealand development cooperation, we're really focused on building in-country capacity and localisation and working collaboratively with partners and stakeholders. So what does this mean in terms of this human rights-based approach that I keep talking about? You'll see on the link that Philippa kindly put in the chat to, well, that's to the strategic action plan, but if you go back to the actual website, it has two documents there. The other document is our human rights-based approach. So this is the first page of that, and you can see by the pretty graphic that was designed, thankfully, by somebody else, not me. You can see that we have these three arms of the things that we're trying to do: respect, protect, fulfill. And these would be very familiar to many of you who work in human rights. What we're trying to always achieve as human rights defenders and human rights advocates is the respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights. How we do that, the methods that the New Zealand government applies in its work, is through three kind of realms: promoting and defending, and that's the kind of making sure that we're not doing any harm and that we're telling other people to not do any harm. The advancing and upholding, and that's kind of a slightly that next level of making sure that we're creating these environments where we can advance human rights and uphold human rights. And then there's the do no harm, so not doing anything around ourselves, and the proactively programming so that we leave nobody behind. Our human rights-based approach is founded on these 7 principles, which up to 8 principles, which are not going to be a big surprise to many of you who've been working with a human rights-based approach for a long time. They're the standard human rights-based approach principles, and slightly kind of tweaked when needed for the New Zealand context. But the idea that human rights are indivisible, interrelated, interdependent. Participation is one of the core principles here, and by that, of course, we mean full and meaningful participation. We've got the principle of non-discrimination, equality, and inclusion, of course, accountability, empowerment, legality, meaning that our approach needs to be compliant with international human rights law, and sustainability and resilience, which are being used by the international community as kind of new principles added to this list of the core human rights-based approach principles, which of course fit very much with the approach that New Zealand takes. So when it comes to what is New Zealand doing for a human rights-based approach, it's applying these basic principles, which are well known to everybody in the international development community. We have provided some guidance for our programming staff and for any of our organisations, our partners that are working with us, just to explain what do we mean by these principles and what could be some of the questions we could be asking as we go along in our activity design stage, in implementation, or an evaluation. If we're looking, for example, at participation, what does that mean? And what are some of the questions that we can ask to ensure, are we thinking about the right things? So if we're asking the questions about what are the obstacles to expressing and hearing people's voices, what's needed for people to express their views, who needs to participate in these development processes, what structures are in place to ensure safe, systematic and ongoing participation. These are some guidelines of questions to be asked to make sure that we can operationalise this human rights-based approach. So all throughout the strategic action plan, we say that it's based on this approach. This document gives us the foundation for what we mean by that. So the action plan itself has 4 key strategic focus areas. The first is focused around building and supporting the capability and capacity of duty bearers. So I'll detail all of these in a moment, but this is just the broad overview. The second one is about rights holders, really the people and groups that we work with. The third that we've identified is a need to focus on how do we incorporate human rights and our human rights-based approach in our crisis response, whether that be COVID or climate change or the various different natural disasters we face or conflict and post-conflict situations. And then the last one is a little bit more internal focused for MFAC, but actually a really important part of this strategic action plan is being transparent with you all to show we're trying to do our mahi as well. So this is about making sure that we are doing quality delivery when it comes to development programming for human rights, mainstreaming human rights throughout our business processes and throughout our evaluations and throughout our data reporting and recording, etc. So this is what it looks like on the A3 that you can download from the website. I don't expect you to be able to read the fine print here. I've got another slide that shows the fine print in a little bit more detail. But the thing I wanted to show you about this is that across these 4 strategic priorities is this application of the human rights-based approach. So the human rights-based approach is not just kind of one of our priorities, but rather it's the overarching thing that needs to happen to make sure that all of these priorities come off. So we're applying the human rights-based approach across all 4 of these priorities. So to look at these in a little bit more detail, this is the 2 which are focused on duty bearers and rights holders. And I don't want to kind of draw a massive distinction between these 2 in general, because of course we all know that in some instances, rights holders can be duty bearers and vice versa. But essentially what we've done is divided this up for our programming. The first one here about capacity and capability building is more focused on the institution aspect. So supporting the architecture of the human rights governance, institutions, mechanisms, monitoring, reporting, implementation by our usually government partners, particularly throughout the Pacific, but also throughout the rest of the world. So building capacity to deliver on human rights commitments, that includes ratification, but it also means participation in the international system and reporting on progress, and supporting our multilateral and regional institutions. And as we know, our regional and multilateral institutions are a really fundamental part of how New Zealand supports human rights work within our region. They're best positioned to be making sure that there's cohesion and coordination across the board on human rights institution building and strengthening and implementation. So we want to maintain that as a priority focus for a lot of our support. And we also want to continue our support for the establishment of national human rights institutions and working with Pacific countries and regional institutions to ensure monitoring mechanisms for reporting and implementation. So part of that also then the last bit is the only way you can actually support duty bearers and ensure that there's implementation is by also making sure that you're contributing to the monitoring and measuring. So that's the data support that we do. And as you'd all know, we currently support a couple of different data initiatives, and that's still a key part of what we're doing under that priority. When it comes to the rights holders, we want to make clear that we take a very community-based approach to this. So the rights holders for us, again, goes back to our bigger picture political priorities that are set out. So the key issues that we're focused on here, and by this I mean the key groups of rights holders that we support, are the SOGS community, so sexual orientation, gender identity and expression and sex characteristics. So what many of you think of as the LGBTI community, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and then of course women, which you've heard from Tara about the Gender Action Plan, children and youth, which you've heard from Maria about the Child and Youth Wellbeing Plan. That's not to say that those plans, that it's a subpart of this, but rather the complete ways in which we address our development programming for those groups are dealt with by separate action plans. But the focus of the Human Rights Action Plan is this overall human rights, but then also the focus on these target populations of SOGIESC, disabilities, and Indigenous people. So for that, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we are prioritising, leaving nobody behind throughout all of our work. So that's more the mainstreaming aspect, but we're also making sure that we have targeted programming it's really designed to address these particular groups. So persons of diverse SOGIESC, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous people. And to do that, we are supporting community action, civil society groups, and the work that they're doing to reduce stigma, to facilitate access to services, enhancing wellbeing and prosperity. And part of the reason for this is because we want to make sure that we're enhancing the voice and visibility of these people in decision-making, not just in our region, but also internationally. So the way in which we support these people through different representative organizations is to make sure that they have a voice, and that, for example, the voice of the Pacific SOGIESC community is seen and heard at the international level, and that the voice of persons with disabilities throughout the Pacific is seen and heard in international decision-making forum. So the other two priorities that we have are about this crisis response. So how do we integrate a human rights-based approach into our work when it comes to humanitarian emergencies, climate, and COVID? How do we make sure that we are integrating inclusion for these at-risk populations, as well as mainstreaming a human rights-based approach, full stop? How do we make sure that our programming for these kinds of situations is sustainable, focused on enhancing resilience in our communities, focused on enhancing participation, and that it's not just an emergency response without that underlying foundation of a human rights-based approach. And the last one, as I said, is a little bit more internal for us. The reason why it's here is because it's really important that you see we're doing the work as well. And that's about making sure we have the tools to integrate our human rights-based approach, that we have systems and processes for ensuring that we're integrating human rights into our programming cycle, that we are monitoring our progress, and that we're making sure that we actually are building the capacity of our people to be able to do this. So I think that that's an important aspect for us to include in this as well. So what all this means is that we will be delivering this through our targeted and mainstreaming program, through our bilateral country teams, our thematic sectors, our multi-country investments that many of you are all familiar with. We will continue our support to regional bodies and the contributions we make to multilateral institutions. We'll be doing our own mahi, our internal capability building, and we will be working in partnership with NGOs and civil society organisations. And these are our main delivery modalities, as they always have been, except now we're focusing these on making sure that we're explicitly incorporating that human rights-based approach. And what this means for us is that we hope we will have a better understanding of human rights, both within MFAT and throughout the organisations, governments, and other stakeholders that we partner with, that we'll be able to mainstream the application of a human rights-based approach into our development programming and use this to demonstrate our deepening commitment that we have as a government to using human rights as a focus, as a tool for good development, and that we will end up with investments that continue to make a large impact when it comes to contributing to the realisation of human rights for all. And that we will be better able to record how we spend our money on human rights impactful activities, as well as how much we spend. So I've spoken for far too long. I want to leave space for questions for you all. And so I know Philippa has already said you should start thinking about your questions. So I'll hand over to her to facilitate if anyone has their hands up. I haven't seen any other questions in the chat yet, but fire them at me. I'm all yours.
Oh, we just got one question just launched into the chat just then, if you want to go for it.
Right, great. Thanks so much. So Steve, thanks, Steve. Steve is saying that he belongs to PSNA, the Palestinian Solidarity Network, Aotearoa New Zealand, He's come to believe that the trade part of NFAT makes it more difficult for us to get recognition in our foreign affairs policy for Palestinians. Human rights as an approach should be able to prioritise those that lack them. Do you think this is a problem? I haven't personally come across that problem, Steve. As you all would know, our trade policy has taken or tries to incorporate an inclusive approach to trade, and our Trade for All policy is predicated on an inclusive approach to trade. As somebody who is the thought leader for human rights within the Pacific and Development Group, I lead on how we do human rights in development. I don't lead on how the trade part of things does human rights, but I have not encountered that how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade does trade has any impact upon how we do our development work on this particular issue. I work with my colleagues in development who do the development policy programming, the development programming for that region of the world. And I can assure you that we apply this human rights-based approach, we apply the human rights strategy to our development in that part of the world, which means that we focus on those most at risk of being left behind by development.
Hi, Claire, can you just maybe stop sharing your PowerPoint?
Oh,
is that
sure.
right?
Sorry.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Then we can see everybody. Feel free to, I hope that answered your question, Steve, but feel free, no, do you want to follow that up?
If I could just have a bit of pushback there. You know, at the start of the year when we were in Auckland at our meeting, Goldrich turned up on the Sunday morning with Duncan Webb, and she was saying that the committee level, she felt as if the trade part was often at the expense of the human rights part, because every 6 months they have a review. And it seemed interesting to me that she would make that comment, but also because we have all these trade links with Israel, and obviously they're the occupying power, that to me is a real problem. So whether you've experienced it or not, I think it could be a problem, but I like the idea of human rights being this neutral way to approach recognizing Palestinians, you know, in Palestine, 139th country, etc. So no, not totally convinced by the answer, but you know, maybe this is a way around it.
Sure, thanks, Steve. I'm not trying to convince you that what I'm saying is, sorry, I'm not trying to convince you that what you're saying is not true or anything. I have a limited ability to speak on this issue, given my position and the limitations of that position. I have a lot of personal opinions, which I cannot share about that. What I am able to say from this position is that in my experience at MFAT, whatever trade situation or relationship New Zealand has not impacted on what I have seen from the development programming side of things. And that's really the limit of what I'd be able to say on that.
All right, other questions? Do feel free to take stuff off mute and maybe put your video on so we can see you if you like. That would be quite nice. While people are thinking of questions, I had one I prepared earlier. While I was listening to you, I was thinking about all this reporting. I know we do a lot of reporting, and I'm just wondering, because, and this is based on my experience working in Australia, I know they had some issues in terms of the coordination of the domestic and international reporting on human rights mechanisms, because of course, you know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is doing a lot, but also a lot happens domestically as well. So I'm just wondering if there's any sort of coordination or communication that goes on there.
Yeah, coordination between who?
Well, between MFAT and who does the domestic human rights.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, now I understand your question better. Thank you so much. Yes, so that's again, because my focus is on how we do our development programming. So how do we contribute to human rights overseas? It's not about how does New Zealand do human rights domestically. There is the United Nations and Human Rights and Commonwealth group within our multilateral division at MFAT that focuses on our political advocacy, but also our reporting to the different treaty bodies, to the UPR, etc. And they work very closely and in conjunction with the Ministry of Justice and all the other government ministries that are responsible for our domestic implementation of human rights obligations, and then our reporting on that. There's a group that is stood up each time there's a report that's due that works on that. Again, my contribution to that is contributing what does the New Zealand government do in terms of its development work. So how do we contribute to, how do we spend our aid money on doing human rights overseas?
Rebecca, did you have a question?
Yeah, if that's okay, Claire. And just to say thank you so much for the presentation. I thought it was really informative and it's been such a valuable session. My first question is just purely admin. Can we have a copy of the PowerPoint?
Oh, absolutely, Rebecca. I've already sent that through to
great.
And it will be going up on the website with a recording of this webinar so that people who couldn't make it today can see the webinar, they can read the PowerPoints, and they have the links and the documents that are on the MVAT website as well. So hopefully that should be a good resource for everybody to use. So I saw that there's another.
Sorry.
Okay, keep going.
So yeah, the more detailed question, and I just want to, I guess, acknowledge and say thank you for just how I think holistic the approach being developed and taken by MFAT is with this human rights strategy. Could you identify where you perceive there being practical barriers or challenges for the New Zealand government to meet these strategic commitments and goals? And I think you touched on really well the contextual challenges, but I'm really interested in implementation challenges from your perspective and ideas, I guess, in how civil society organisations like World Vision and others on these calls can help MFAT and the government with these goals.
Honestly, I think the biggest implementation challenge is that contextual challenge in terms of the deepening understanding of what human rights means. So a lot of the challenge that I see is this concern around political sensitivity, around the fact that human rights, we look at and we think of what's happening in this part of the world or what's happening in that part of the world, this particular incidents that we see on the news. We think about it from a foreign policy diplomacy point of view of, well, how can the New Zealand government approach this issue or deal with this issue? What I'm really trying to encourage my colleagues within MFAT, as well as all of you in terms of civil society in your engagements with the New Zealand government, is to remember the proactive, positive role that human rights can play in shaping good development and helping us to make sure that we are understanding those dual approaches and that language that's needed. So I think one of the key challenges with implementation is if governments, not just New Zealand government, but all governments in our region, continue to see human rights as a compliance issue or as a barrier to good diplomacy and to close relationships. But rather, if we can shift that mindset to seeing human rights as a tool for enhancing our development, I think that's the key to implementation. I think that's probably still a bit too high level for what you were intending, but from my perspective, it sounds high level, but actually filters through into everything we do, from the language that we use in our strategic partnerships to the way in which we train our implementing team members, to the way in which we report and record and monitor the data that we need to gather. All of those things, that they are based on that understanding about what do we actually mean by human rights. And this, I think, is linked to, there's a question in the chat saying, is this all predicated on or in conjunction with the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? So I'm not sure, this person may have arrived a little bit late, but at the very beginning of the presentation, I explained that one of the foundations of where this work comes from is the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and the idea that 92% of the Sustainable Development Goals are directly related to human rights, including labour standards. And so what that means is that in order to implement the SDGs, in order to realise and achieve the SDGs, we need to be facilitating and supporting the implementation and realisation of human rights. These things absolutely go hand in hand. Just like human rights themselves are indivisible, so we can't just focus on housing without it also impacting health and food security and our engagement in political processes. We also can't separate sustainable development from the enjoyment of human rights. So I hope that answered your question, Rebecca, as well as Jules's question in the chat as well.
Absolutely, it was really, really helpful. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks for the question, Rebecca.
But feel free to, yeah, as I said, take yourself off mute. I mean, we're really lucky to have the expert here, so take advantage of that and ask her all things that you want to know about the Human Rights Action Plan of impact. Andrew?
Hi, yeah, I mean, I work for the Leprosy Mission New Zealand, and we do, like you said, a lot of work revolved around human rights. But I mean, I'm not sure that measures human rights through MFAT. So I was just wondering, you said about 50% maybe of what MFAT does is sort of not recorded as human rights. So is MFAT going to sort of change this or sort of monitor or measure it in a sort of different way so that, like a lot of the good stuff that we're doing is actually sort of seen as human rights?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Great question. And I can absolutely assure you from having had my head in the data at a very deep level for a long time, the leprosy work is included in the human rights calculations. So you're in my count. Don't worry about that. But yes, I think that there's a few issues here. So OECD DAC puts out guidelines as to how to record the spend of our Overseas Development Assistance Fund. And they have a measure for what's called a marker for human rights. They have a marker for disability. They don't have a marker for human rights. They have one for disability. MFAT has a marker for human rights. So we are trying to measure human rights, but it's sometimes difficult to do this when our staff need capability training around how to use it and what human rights means. So you can have a great marker that's meant to be tagged in all sorts of programming so that it counts the money that's being spent. But if people see the word human rights and they think, oh, this doesn't include any, sensitive political issues, I don't need to tag it for human rights, then it won't get included. So that's why I say the fundamental to how do we improve implementation of this is improving our capability amongst ourselves and our partners to understand what human rights are. Because if the programming officers are understanding better that their food security program is a human rights program, if their health program that deals with leprosy is a human rights program, they'll tag it human rights, it'll show up in our count, and therefore we'll be better at recording the work that we do. So that's a lot of work for us to do behind the scenes, but I want to assure you that that's where the behind the scenes work is really happening. And it's one of the reasons why we decided not to put a percentage target on this. We think that the way in which we're calculating what we spend, the way in which we're actually doing the programming is more important than the final number, partly because that final number isn't truly representative right now of the actual work that we're doing. And if we increase our capability around the work that we're doing, it will increase the number naturally. So there's another question here from Angela. Thanks. Oh, and I saw okay, two questions here from Angela. How have you connected the Human Rights Action Plan with the various Indigenous values as promoted by Minister Mahuta? And you mentioned security, but there seem to be opportunities here for Aotearoa to make explicit connections on the world stage. And then the next one is, as per the questions from Stephen and Philippa, to connect these Indigenous values with human rights, looking at our interconnectedness among all things, including trade and our domestic realities, seem to be a critical, holistic human rights approach, and would love to see you push for this interconnectedness more at MFAT. So I can give you my absolute personal assurance that I have done my best to push for this interconnectedness between the different parts of MFAT. As you'll all be very aware, any large organisation has different sections that work on different things. We try as much as we can to coordinate and make sure we're all on the same page. And I've been doing that as much as I can. Absolutely, the Human Rights Action Plan is based around the Indigenous values that Minister Mahuta has put out. So for those eagle-eyed amongst you, you would have seen when I spoke about the fact that it's based on Te Tiriti, it also says, and the values of Aotearoa. And so those values are the ones that Minister Mahuta put out. There is a deep connection between the way in which we understand Te Tiriti principles, as well as the principles that the Minister has promoted, and the connection between those and the principles of human rights. These are not different things, they're interrelated, and they all speak they speak different languages, but they speak to the same outcomes. We decided not to put those explicitly in the 1A3 page, partly because it's so much information to get onto an A3. How do we also spell that out? And also because we're very aware of the fact that these the values that you're speaking about are wonderful Te values, which we use and interpret and apply to the work that we do. But in terms of a one-page document that we want the world to see, and we want it to be understandable to the world, including our partners, we wanted to make sure that it's about the values of Aotearoa, and those are elaborated in other documents, including the minister's fantastic speeches. And we want to leave that for the minister to articulate those. And we've set out very clearly that we apply those, but we didn't have the space in that one page to detail exactly how we apply those. But rest assured, that's a key fundamental part of what we think of when we think of the human rights approach at MFAT. So there's another question here from Steve. Thanks, Steve. Does MFAT plans?
Yeah, can I just speak to this? You know, this year, for example, in January and again in April, you know, two very respected human rights organizations, B'Tselem in January and then in April, the Human Rights Watch, they condemned the apartheid, and used the apartheid word for Israel-Palestine. And of course, the politics of human rights means that those people are in denial about it for one reason or another, even though these, you know, 213-page reports and, you know, from both sides of the fence are coming out and condemning Israel for this undermining and absence of human rights. In this case, I think, you know, it's up to governments like ours to speak out. Do you see any greater role for us to, when people are in denial about human rights being biased or, you know, not following it, that we should also follow it up with maybe a public statement, you know, from our values, reaffirming the authority of these human rights?
Thanks.
Yeah, in the action plan, there is that broader question about, you know, there's advocacy is in the action plan. So what exactly do you mean by advocacy? That what sort of advocacy would in fact do on these issues and others?
So our political advocacy work, our position on particular things like that, and when MFAT speaks up and in which ways, sometimes as civil society advocates, we don't always see what governments are doing behind the scenes. So we may not be aware that action happens when it is happening. How this all gets done is done by our multilateral division within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They deal with our foreign policy engagement on human rights issues. They deal very closely with the minister and take recommendations to her and vice versa. When it comes to the work of the development group and how our development program works on these issues, we would absolutely do that in conjunction with our multilateral division. And we have a role to play when it affects our development programming and the development work that we do. But in terms of the kinds of issues that you're speaking about, that's the multilateral division within MFAT that does that role of upholding, defending, promoting human rights principles in our political engagement. I can tell you that they are very proactive in the work that they do on those human rights issues. And they're in constant
public statements. You know, I think we just don't hear public statements.
Have you been watching the minister's Twitter feed? Because she's making public statements about human rights all the time.
Yeah, I'm not counting Twitter actually. Yeah, I mean, you know, coming out on mainstream media. That's what I'm counting.
So I think that those issues you'll have to take up with our multilateral division. But just on a personal level, I'd really encourage you to follow the minister's Twitter feed, because
I do, but I'm talking about mainstream media.
Policy statements on human rights issues are often transacted by Twitter.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. So we could squeeze one more question in. Does anyone have a burning question? No, we're all good. Do feel free to reach out to myself or to Sid if you've got any questions, and we can pass those on to Claire or to the new person who'll be implementing the plan for MFAT in the future. But yeah, thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you all for coming along and listening, and I look forward to engaging with you.